The sun was just beginning to set over the rolling golden fields, painting the sky with streaks of amber and rose as the little white church stood proudly in the open countryside, its bell tower silent, its doors wide, ready to welcome love and promises that were supposed to last forever. And inside that small sanctuary, guests filled the pews, whispering in excitement, watching as the bride prepared for her moment, the moment she had dreamed about since childhood, the moment she thought would seal her happiness, her faith in love, her trust in a man who had once sworn she was his everything. But behind the carved wooden doors in the small bridal room, Clara's hands trembled around the bouquet of wild daisies and roses, her heart pounding not from joy but from the gnawing anxiety that had been haunting her since dawn, a feeling that something was wrong, something hidden, something waiting to shatter her perfect day. And though the lace of her white gown hugged her frame and the veil cascaded in soft waves, though the mirror reflected a woman glowing with the beauty of love's promise, her eyes carried shadows, a whisper of doubt, and she tried to silence them, reminding herself that Michael, her fiancé, the man who had courted her with sweet words and grand gestures, was waiting for her at the altar, waiting to vow forever. Yet fate had different plans. The music swelled, the doors opened, and Clara stepped into the aisle, the air thick with the fragrance of flowers and the weight of expectation, her father's arm steadying her as they walked forward. But as her gaze lifted, seeking Michael's eyes at the altar, she froze, for what she saw was not the warmth of love but the cold flicker of guilt and something darker, a glance exchanged between him and her supposed best friend seated in the front row, a glance too intimate, too knowing, and Clara's heart cracked though she kept moving. Her face composed, her breath shallow, her mind racing back to all the little signs she had ignored, the secretive smiles, the hurried excuses, the faint trace of perfume that wasn't hers on his jacket weeks before, and now, under the vaulted ceiling of God's house, everything collided, truth crashing into her chest. Michael took her hand, his grip clammy, his smile forced, and as the pastor began to speak, Clara felt the ground shifting, her stomach churning, the vows about love, faithfulness, and trust burning like cruel irony in her ears. And when the pastor asked if anyone had reason to object, the silence in the church was louder than thunder. But in Clara's heart there was screaming. Screaming to run, to fight, to demand answers, yet she held still, a tear pricking her lashes until the moment Michael's phone, hidden poorly in his pocket, buzzed and Clara, almost unconsciously, glimpsed the screen lighting up with a message. "Can't wait to see you tonight. My love. Forever yours." The world tilted, her lungs refused to fill, and she pulled her hand away, eyes dazing, her voice breaking as she whispered, "How could you?" The congregation gasped. Michael stammered, his face pale, and her best friend shifted uncomfortably in her seat, guilt painted all over her flushed cheeks. And in that instant, the betrayal was naked before everyone. No excuses, no lies strong enough to mask the truth, and Clara's heart shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. She turned, bouquet slipping from her fingers, petals scattering like the dreams she once held, and she ran, the murmurs and shocked cries of the guests fading behind her, her veil catching in the doorway as she pushed through, stumbling into the open field, the cool wind mixing with the heat of her tears, her chest heaving with sobs that carried both rage and grief, and she felt utterly alone, abandoned, humiliated, the world crumbling when it was supposed to be built anew. She fell to her knees in the tall grass, clutching at the earth as if it could ground her against the storm inside, and she thought of every promise Michael had made, every word whispered in the moonlight, every touch that now felt like poison, and she wondered how she could have been so blind, so trusting, so foolish, and despair threatened to swallow her whole until she heard the steady sound of boots crunching over the dry earth, a presence approaching with quiet strength, and when she lifted her tear-streaked face, she saw him, the cowboy, tall and broad-shouldered, with sunlit hair beneath a black hat, his eyes holding both compassion and fire, a man who had been standing at the edges of her world unnoticed, watching silently, respecting boundaries, yet unable to ignore the ache he felt for her. And now in her darkest hour, he reached out a hand, rough from labor yet gentle, offering not pity but solidarity. Not words but the promise of action. Clara hesitated, her pride warring with her pain, her fear whispering not to trust again, but the warmth in his gaze was steady, unshaken, and though she did not know if she could ever love again, in that moment she knew she could not face the abyss alone, and so she placed her trembling hand in his, a fragile surrender, a fragile beginning, And together they rose, the church bells behind them ringing, not for her betrayal but perhaps for something greater waiting to be born. The air outside the little church grew cooler as twilight deepened, the golden sun slipping behind the horizon and leaving streaks of lavender and indigo in its wake. And Clara stood beside the cowboy whose hand still enclosed hers, steadying her trembling frame, anchoring her against the chaos of betrayal that still rang like a cruel echo in her heart. And though she had no words, though her throat burned from the tears and humiliation, she felt the silent strength of the man beside her, a stranger in one sense but familiar in another, for she had seen him before at town gatherings, at the farmer's market, riding through the fields with a quiet grace that set him apart, always nodding politely but never intruding, as though he knew boundaries better than most men. And now in this strange twist of fate, he was the only one standing with her, while the man she had promised her life to revealed himself as nothing more than a coward bound in lies. Inside the church, voices rose, guests murmuring in shock. Michael's voice strained as he tried to justify the unjustifiable, her so-called best friend stammering through half-hearted excuses. But Clara did not turn back, for to look again at them would be to reopen a wound that was already bleeding too much, and instead she let the cowboy guide her a few paces away, to where the tall grass whispered in the evening breeze. And there he spoke, his voice low, steady, carrying the warmth of the earth itself. "You don't deserve what he did, miss. No woman does." His words struck her like a balm and a blade all at once, soothing in their sincerity, cutting in the truth they carried, and she swallowed hard, her fingers clutching at the folds of her dress, whispering through trembling lips, "I thought I knew him. I thought he loved me." The cowboy removed his hat, holding it against his chest in a gesture of respect, his eyes meeting hers without flinching. Some men talk about love, but they don't know how to live it. It's not in the words. It's in what you do when it matters, and Clara's heart squeezed at the simplicity of his truth, and she realized she had been drowning in words for years. Michael's promises, Michael's speeches, Michael's declarations of forever. But when she thought back, she saw the cracks she had ignored, the times he had failed to show up, the times he had made her feel small, the way he had often left her waiting for him in the rain while he chased after some excuse, and it all clicked in a way that hurt but also freed her. The cowboy extended his hand once more, not demanding, not presuming, simply offering, and this time she took it without hesitation, because she needed the support. Because something about his presence carried safety, as though he was not there to trap her but to remind her she still had strength. Together they walked, leaving behind the church that now felt like a tomb of broken vows. And as they moved farther into the open field, Clara breathed deeper, the air filling her lungs as though she had been suffocating inside, and with every step, the weight of betrayal lightened, replaced by something unfamiliar but steady. They reached the edge of a weathered fence where his horse was tied, a strong chestnut mare with intelligent eyes, and Clara paused, realizing she was stepping into a world far different from the one she had expected to live when she dressed that morning, a world of dust and honesty, of grit and unspoken truths. The cowboy stroked the horse's mane gently, speaking to it before turning back to her. "Name's Luke," he said, his voice carrying no arrogance, just plain introduction. "Luke Carter. I work the ranch a few miles west." Clara blinked at him, the name settling in her mind, and after a breath she whispered, Clara Hayes, at least I thought I'd be Clara Montgomery after today." The bitterness in her own voice surprised her, and tears threatened again. But Luke shook his head softly. "Montgomery's not a name worth taking. You've got your own. Hold on to it." The conviction in his tone struck something inside her, something long buried beneath the compromises she had made for Michael. The times she had dimmed her own light to let his shine, the times she had set aside her dreams to support his, and suddenly she saw how much she had lost before the betrayal even came to light. Silence stretched between them, not heavy but comfortable, the kind of silence that allows breathing, and Clara found herself studying him, the rugged lines of his face, the calluses on his hands, the way he stood firm but not imposing, and she realized he was the kind of man who carried his truth in his posture, who did not need to dress it up in fine suits or flowery words, and it stirred something deep inside her, a longing for honesty, for simplicity, for a kind of love that could withstand storms instead of crumbling at the first test. Luke, sensing her gaze, tipped his hat back on, giving her a small, respectful nod, and said, "You don't have to go back in there tonight. Folks will talk, sure, but let them. Their words won't change what happened, and they won't define who you are. You can ride out with me if you want, just until you're ready to stand on your own 2 feet. Again." Clara's breath caught. For the offer was more than kindness, it was a lifeline. A chance to step away from the wreckage and into a horizon that might hold healing. She hesitated, torn between the fear of scandal and the hunger for escape. But when she pictured Michael's face, his lies, his betrayal, she realized there was nothing left to salvage, nothing left to return to, and so she nodded, whispering, "Please, take me away from here." Luke's eyes softened, and he helped her mount the horse, his hand steady at her waist, his touch careful not to overstep. And once he climbed behind her, reins in hand, they rode into the night, leaving behind the whispers, the broken vows, the shattered illusions, and as the wind rushed against her cheeks and the stars began to prick the sky, Clara felt for the first time in years the stirrings of freedom, fragile and uncertain but real, and she clung not to Luke but to the idea that maybe, just maybe, this betrayal was not the end, but the beginning of something far greater, something written not in empty words but in actions, in choices, in the courage to start again. Morning light spilled across the Carter Ranch like liquid gold, bathing the wide-open fields in warmth and chasing away the shadows of the night before. And Clara, seated on the porch with a borrowed blanket wrapped around her shoulders, stared at the horizon as though searching for answers hidden in the endless sky, her heart still raw from betrayal yet beginning to beat with a strange new rhythm, one that matched the steady cadence of boots on the wooden boards behind her. And when Luke stepped out, coffee mug in hand, the sight of him standing there, so grounded, so unshaken by life's storms, stirred something inside her she could neither name nor deny, though she quickly looked away, embarrassed by the intensity of her thoughts, for she had only just torn free from a man who had promised her forever and delivered nothing but lies. And yet here she was, already feeling the stirrings of trust in someone she barely knew. Luke, sensing her unease but not pressing, handed her the coffee with a quiet smile, saying only, "Cold nights are easier with a warm morning," and his words, though simple, wrapped around her heart like balm, reminding her that healing did not come in grand speeches but in steady kindnesses, in little moments that built a bridge back to hope. For days that followed, Clara stayed at the ranch, helping in small ways, feeding chickens, brushing down the horses, learning how to mend fences alongside Luke, and each task, though foreign to her city-bred upbringing, grounded her, reminding her that life did not have to revolve around betrayal or broken promises, that her worth was not tied to the man who had deceived her, but to her own 2 hands, her own strength, and the quiet courage to keep moving forward. The town, of course, buzzed with gossip, whispers about the runaway bride and the cowboy who had carried her away, some voices cruel, others sympathetic, and though the weight of their judgment pressed on her shoulders, Clara found that with Luke beside her she could bear it. For he never once looked at her with pity, only with respect, as though he saw not a woman abandoned, but a woman brave enough to walk away. Yet the shadows of the past were not so easily left behind, for one afternoon as the sun hung high and the fields shimmered with heat, Michael arrived, his polished boots out of place in the dust of the ranch, his voice sharp with desperation as he called her name, insisting that everything had been a mistake, that the message had been misunderstood, that he loved her still. And Clara's heart trembled at the sound of his familiar tone, a tone once used to charm her, to wrap her in false security, but now it grated against her soul, for she had seen too much, felt too much to ever be blinded again. Luke, standing between her and Michael, his jaw set, his eyes burning with quiet fire, did not raise his voice, did not need to, for his presence alone was enough to draw a line in the dust, and he said calmly but firmly, "She doesn't owe you anything anymore." Michael sneered, his pride stung by the sight of another man defending the woman he had so carelessly wounded, and he spat bitter words accusing Clara of betrayal, twisting the story to paint himself the victim. But Clara, standing taller than she thought she could, stepped forward, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger with each word. "No, Michael, I was the one betrayed. You looked me in the eyes and promised forever, and then you gave your heart to someone else before the vows were even spoken. I am done letting your lies define me." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the restless snort of Luke's mare nearby, and Michael, unable to face the truth, stormed away. his figure shrinking against the vastness of the land, leaving behind the bitter echo of what could never be repaired. Clara turned then, her knees weak, her hands trembling. But Luke caught her gently, steadying her, not with words but with the quiet strength of a man who knew that healing came not from erasing pain but from facing it and choosing to rise. Days turned into weeks, and Clara found herself not only surviving but changing, learning the rhythm of ranch life, the honesty of hard work, the peace of watching sunsets with Luke in silence. And though neither spoke of love, it hung between them like a fragile seed, waiting for the right season to bloom. One evening, as the town prepared for a harvest festival, Clara was invited by neighbors to attend, and though she hesitated, fearing whispers and stares, Luke looked at her with steady eyes and said, "You've got nothing to hide from. You walked away with dignity, Clara. That makes you stronger than any of them." Taking courage from his words, she went, and under the twinkle of lanterns strung across the square, surrounded by music and laughter, she felt alive again, not as the woman who had been left at the altar, but as a woman who had chosen her own path. And when Luke offered his hand to dance, she took it, her heart racing not with fear but with possibility. And as they moved together across the worn boards of the dance floor, the world seemed to fade until it was only the two of them, his hand steady at her back, his gaze never wavering from hers, and she knew deep in her soul that this was the beginning of something real, something unshakable. Yet even in that moment of joy, Clara understood that love, if it came, would not be a rescue but a partnership, not a promise easily spoken and easily broken, but a bond built in the quiet moments, in shared burdens, in trust earned day by day. And for the first time in her life, she was ready to wait for it, ready to nurture it, ready to choose it on her own terms.